Hello and welcome in a new episode preparing you for the PMP exam. I'm your instructor Nader Omran. Today we will talk about define scope process. At the end of this episode, we should be able to list which documents we may need to define the project scope, explain the tools and skills needed by defining the scope, and create the project statement of work (SOW). Define scope. In this process, we develop a detailed description about the project and the product. Here we try to find a relation between the requirements defined in the requirements documentation and the scope of the project. Because oftentimes some requirements identified in the collect requirements process are not needed in the project. Here in the defining scope process, we define the final needed requirements for the project. And the final selected requirement and the project deliverables will be widely described with more detailed assumptions and constraints that are documented during the project initiation in the project statement of work (SOW). Defining scope is an iterative process through the planning phase. Because to define the scope, we need the status of existing risks, assumptions, and constraints, which they are also iterative. Let's go to the inputs we need to start defining the scope. The inputs to define scope process are: the scope management plan is our first input to define the scope. We know that the scope management plan is a subsidiary plan of the project management plan. We need it because it includes guidelines on how to establish and manage the activities for developing, monitoring, and controlling the project scope. The second input is the project charter. Because the project charter provides the high-level project and product descriptions and characteristics. Project charter contains also the approval requirements to start the project.
But sometimes organizations doesn't provide project charter.
If a project charter is not used in the performing organization, then comparable information needs to be acquired or developed to be used as a basis for the detailed project scope statement. Such organizations will usually perform an informal analysis to identify the content necessary for further scope planning. We will need also the requirements documentation from the collect requirements process. This documentation will be used to select or deselect the requirements that will be included in the project. We need also the organizational process assets, because organizational process assets may influence how scope is defined. For example, we will need the policies, procedures, and templates for the project scope statement, or project files from previous projects and lessons learned. Now let's see which tools and techniques we may use to define the scope. The first one is expert judgment. Here we are analyzing the information needed to develop the project scope statement. Analyzing the information we get from the project charter and the requirements documentation about the project and the product.
Can you tell me who can help me by analyzing the project and the product descriptions?
You will need to get in touch with people or groups who have such expertise and knowledge. such as stakeholders including customers or sponsors, other departments within the organization, consultant, professional and technical associations, industry groups, and subject matter experts. You may get such question in the exam. You see few project team members are analyzing the technical details for the project or the product description, or the information needed to develop the project scope statement. In which process and process group they are working?
Define scope in the planning process group.
Correct. The second tool is product analysis. Product analysis is usually used in projects that produce a product. It's all about converting high-level product descriptions into detailed scope for the product. This effort is highly dependent on the industry of the project deliverable and best practices. That's why you will need the expert's support if you are not aware of the project industry.
Okay. I got the inputs and the experts. How to analyze the product?
Well, there are several known techniques such as product breakdown. As the name says, dividing the product into smaller parts make it easier to define the scope. Systems analysis. We use it by complex systems and internal interactions. Requirements analysis. And systems engineering or value engineering. Here we improve the value of the product by looking at options to improve the functions and decrease the cost. And value analysis techniques. Here we are analyzing how much value will the product gives the end user. But we will not talk widely about these techniques. You can search the internet to get more view about these techniques. But for the exam, you need to know that the product breakdown, system analysis, requirements analysis, system engineering, value engineering, and value analysis are techniques to use when we conduct the product analysis. A third tool names alternative generation. Alternatives generation is a technique used to develop as many options as possible in order to find different ways to execute and perform the work of the project. Here we use three general management techniques, such as brainstorming, lateral thinking, and analysis of alternatives. And that leads us to the fourth tool, which is facilitated workshops. We talked about facilitated workshops in a previous episode. That was one of the tools and techniques used to collect the requirements. The advantage here is to bring stakeholders in these intensive working sessions. And that helps to reach a cross-functional and common understanding of the project objectives and its limits. That was the tools and technique to conduct the defining scope process. Let's move to the output of this process. The first output is project scope statement. This is a document containing the detailed description of the project scope, deliverables, assumptions, and constraints. It documents the whole scope, including the project and product scope. And it describes in details the project deliverables and the work required to create those deliverables. It also helps the project stakeholders to have a common understanding of the project scope. It may help by managing stakeholders' expectations because it defines the agreed requirements, what is needed and what not, to be clear to all stakeholders. It helps the project team to perform more detailed planning, to guide the project team's work during the execution. And it provides the baseline for future change requests or additional work needed.
How far it should be detailed.
As more detailed as easy for the project management team to have a control over the project scope. The detailed project scope statement includes the following. Product scope description. The characteristics of the deliverables described in the project charter and requirements documentation. This information is progressively elaborated, and it should be always updated. Acceptance criteria. This is the conditions that are required to be met to get acceptance for the deliverables. Deliverable. This is the unique product, service, or result to be produced at the end of the project or phase. Keep in mind, you may get a deliverable at the end of a process or phase, and that called also milestone. Project exclusion. This information identifies what is excluded from the project and what is out of the scope. That helps to manage stakeholders' expectations. Constraints. This is a list with descriptions of the specific internal or external restrictions or limitations that affect the project scope and the execution of the project. Internal, like the enterprise environmental factors, or external, like governmental regulations. You should include this information in the project scope statement or in a separate log. Assumptions. Those are points of considerations while the planning process. Things that may happen or not. It could be true, real, or certain, without proof or demonstration. Also, we should describe the impact of these assumptions if they occur. Project teams frequently validate assumptions as part of their planning process. We may include this information in the project scope statement or in a separate log. You will notice that the project charter and the project scope statement are similar to each other, but they are different in the level of details contained in each. The project charter contains high-level information, while the project scope statement contains a detailed description of the scope elements. Those elements are progressively elaborated throughout the project. And please keep in mind that the project scope statement is the most frequently updated document. The second output by defining the scope is the project document update. This is actually not a document. Here you just may need to update some documents such as stakeholder register. We all know that a key stakeholder is much familiar with the industry field of the project, so you have to update your stakeholder register. Requirements documentation. You may identify items that need to be changed, or you may come across assumptions or constraints that are no longer valid, or you may identify a new one. Requirements traceability metrics. You may find some requirements are not available at the moment. Here also you have to update the requirements traceability metrics. Let's take a look at the process overview where we visualize the information. The inputs to the defined scope process are the scope management plan. It's an output from the plan scope management plan process. And project charter from the process of developing project charter. the requirements documentation from the collect requirements process. Also the organizational process assets, such as policies, procedures, and templates from the performing organization. After performing the tools and technique, we came out with the project scope statement and documents update activities. The project scope statement will be needed in 6 other planning processes. In Create WPS process and Sequence Activities process. Also, it is an input to the Estimate Activity Durations process and Develop Schedule, Plan Risk Management, and Perform Qualitative Risk Analysis. The second output is just an activity which is updating project documents such as stakeholder register, requirements documentation, and requirements traceability metrics. We arrived to the end of this episode. Now we are able to list which documents we may need to define the project scope, explain the tools and skills needed by defining the scope, and create the project statement of work, SOW. I hope it was informative for you and thank you for watching.